A few weeks ago, Gary Russell Jr. was sending for Terence Crawford. But now I turn around and all of a sudden, he's sending for Devin Haney. How did we get here? How did we go from Gary Russell Jr. talking about he wants to fight Terence Crawford and bringing up their gym beef and talking about jumping up however many weight divisions to welterweight to face Bud? And there were apparently some type of talks behind the scenes about whether that fight was viable. So we've gone from that to him now trying to do the same thing with Devin Haney. What's going on with Gary Russell Jr.? How did Devin Haney get dragged into this? Did he chip in his 2 cents about the Bud Crawford situation? I don't know. What did I miss? Gary Russell Jr. has never had a reputation as a likable guy. And I've spoken about this in previous videos. I've been, speaking about Gary Russell in terms of behind the scenes for a few years. And from what I've been told over the years by people who have met him and interacted with him in the gyms in America, they say the guy has got a serious Napoleon complex. Little short guy, and he feels like he needs to overcompensate by being, a serious, what. Right? So that's how Gary Russell tends to be. Now, I did see him mentioning people like Gervonta Davis, I think in some tweets or whatever, or some interviews. And you see, he seems to have got upset with the fact that the majority of the boxing world has backed Terence Crawford in this Russell Jr. Crawford situation. They're backing Crawford. Crawford is the more successful guy. He's the more popular guy. He's the more likable guy. So they're all backing Crawford, and Gary Russell Jr. is very upset about that. He's incensed. And now he's lashing out at everybody. That's what it seems to be to me. So now he's talking about this Devin Haney situation. Well, Devin Haney and his dad have both been on camera saying that they've sent, and Devin Haney, obviously you can see from his Twitter account, they've sent some type of offer to Gary Russell Jr. for a fight. And Gary Russell is a featherweight. He'd be jumping up 2 weight divisions to face Devin Haney. Okay, so, he must be a different type of angry, or he's just looking for maybe a cash out fight, because Gary Russell Jr. has been around a long time. He's had over 30 fights, and he's always had terrible hand trouble since very early on in Gary Russell's career. He was breaking his hands in most fights. That's how bad his hand trouble is. He's a tiny little guy, only 5'3", 5'4". But he wears like 20-ounce gloves a lot of the time in training because his hands are so brittle. So I'm just wondering, because of those hand issues, and that's led to him not being particularly active for a lot of his career. I'm just wondering, because of those hand issues, is he thinking about a cash out fight? Is he thinking, you know what, let me roll the dice and move up several weight divisions. If Al Heyman can't get me the fights I want at featherweight or super featherweight, let me jump up 2 weight divisions. Let me jump up 3, 4 weight divisions. Maybe that is what is on Gary Russell Jr.'s mind. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Because, again, Devin Haney is a strange fight to want to pick. Maybe he saw the fact that Vasyl Lomachenko has moved all the way up to, lightweight. He thinks he can do the same, but he's not as big as Lomachenko. Lomachenko's a taller guy and he's just physically bigger. You saw when they actually fought. And it is interesting. People are pointing this out, that Gary Russell is calling out all these people, but the one person, as far as I know, that he hasn't really been calling out in any major way is Lomachenko. Shouldn't he want to run that back since he is acting like he can take on the whole world? Well, if we look at this Devin Haney situation specifically, he was talking about he wanted to fight Gary Russell, that is. Haney and his dad say they've sent an offer to Gary Russell. But in this interview, Gary Russell says he turned the offer down basically because he didn't like the fact that the contract, or whatever agreement it was, didn't stipulate what network the fight would be on and who'd be promoting it. He just heard from whether it was Bill Haney or whoever else from that side he just heard from them that DAZN and Eddie Hearn would be picking it up, and they are going to be the promoter and the broadcaster. But Gary Russell's saying, well, that's just hearsay. I want to see it in writing. Right now, you're just trying to get me to sign a blank check. Now, to be perfectly fair, right, and Bill Haney's going back and forth with Gary Russell. He's all upset. I mean, I don't know how much of this is real beef. It could be real beef, or maybe it's just a bit of theater. Maybe it's just both parties understand that there's a mutual benefit in beefing like this, because it creates hype. It keeps their names in the mouths of fans and all that kind of stuff. And how much of it is genuine, I don't know. But to be fair to Gary Russell, he's an unlikable guy, but that doesn't mean that he's wrong. You see, this is where a lot of people tend to lose their footing in situations like this. They tend to automatically side with the person who's more likable. But the person who's more likable isn't always right. Yeah. Gary Russell, I'm struggling to find a word to describe him. Obviously, you got to be careful with the YouTube algorithm these days. You can't swear at anything like that. But, again, he's not a likable guy. Doesn't mean he's wrong. Yeah, could be telling the truth. And maybe he has some very valid concerns about this contract that doesn't have the promoter, and it doesn't have the broadcaster on it. Why doesn't it have those things? Surely Team Haney can go back to DAZN and to Matchroom and say, okay, he wants your names on this piece of paper. Will you do that? Surely he can get that done, because the money apparently that Gary Russell demanded, or the money he was willing to settle for, that was on the piece of paper. It's just that the promoter and the broadcaster weren't. So I don't know. I don't think Gary Russell Jr.'s, look, I'm not privy to the behind the scenes negotiations, and I don't deal with boxing contracts. So this is just an outsider's opinion, but it doesn't sound like what Gary Russell Jr. is asking for is particularly unreasonable. It doesn't sound unreasonable to me. Now, could he move the goalposts if they adhere to this particular demand? Maybe. And if that's the case, if he moves the goalposts again, then maybe he don't really want to fight. Maybe he's just clout chasing, as they call it these days. So I don't know. Personally, I think it's all quite funny. This angry little garden gnome, Gary Russell Jr., calling out the entire world of boxing. I mean, who's next? Is he going to be calling out the Gypsy King, Tyson Fury? Where does it stop with Gary Russell? Because he seems to want all the smoke, or he's acting like he wants all the smoke. Didn't he also, maybe he didn't, but I'm sure he was talking about Gervonta Davis, Broner as well, maybe, I don't know. Gary Russell just talking about fighting everybody, maybe at the same time. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below about this Gary Russell, Devin Haney situation, and Gary Russell in general. What do you make of him as a character? Do you think that he's looking for a cash out fight? Because for the longest time, he couldn't get the fights he wanted on PBC, and he's still with PBC and Al, right? But he called out Al Heyman, saying that Heyman was protecting Santa Cruz from him and all that kind of stuff, and other fighters. So maybe this is his desperate attempt to just get whatever fight he can for big money, and win or lose, he's, made some decent change, and he can sail off into the sunset with his shattered hands and his colossal ego. Oh, and before I go, Eddie Hearn has actually talked about the possibility of a Gary Russell Jr. fight happening. So to quote Eddie Hearn directly, he said, Devin has been doing a great job in keeping his profile active during lockdown, but now it's almost time to get busy in the ring. November 7 is the targeted date for his return, and the two main targets are Gary Russell Jr. and Yuriorkis Gamboa. Both are great fights for Devin as he approaches a key stretch in his career to become a standout star. Devin is ready to defend his WBC titles against all comers, and I can't wait to see him back in the ring in November, end quote. Well, look, these are two small guys that Eddie Hearn's talking about, Yuriorkis Gamboa and Gary Russell. Yuriorkis Gamboa has obviously had more experience at a higher weight than Gary Russell as a professional, but he's shot to pieces at this point. I mean, Gamboa's been shot to pieces for years. When we saw the fight he had against Gervonta Davis, right? The guy is absolutely shot to bits. Why are they still recycling this dude and giving him world title shots? Is he the new Zab Judah? Yuriorkis Gamboa? Please no. Gary Russell Jr., even though he's a small guy too and he'd be jumping up several weight divisions to fight Devin Haney, to me, he's less damaged. Yeah, he's got brittle hands, but he hasn't taken all the head, well, he's taken plenty of head punches, but maybe not as many as Yuriorkis Gamboa. And at the lighter weights anyway, Gary Russell's chin seems to be solid, whereas Gamboa was always chinny. In fact, even at, some of the lighter weights, Gamboa's chin was a little suspect. So out of the two fights, I prefer to see Haney versus Gary Russell Jr. I think Gary Russell's still got more in the tank than Gamboa. But ideally, you want to see Devin Haney fight people his own size. Obviously, there's the winner of Luke Campbell, Ryan Garcia, and several other fights at lightweight. So yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. It's happening, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.